Is China on the brink of a revolution? For the first time in over 3 decades, Chinese citizens are done with their government. Does this mean the end of their authoritarian rule? What are the protests about, and what do the white sheets of paper mean? Today, we're doing a deep dive into Chinese politics to answer all these questions. Stick around to see what these shockwaves of protests mean for the future of China and the rest of the world. China's draconian zero-COVID policies. China's population was growing increasingly frustrated with the zero-COVID policy. People were subjected to sudden and harsh lockdowns even as the rest of the world was returning to semblance of normal life. And the reasons were simple. China's COVID-19 strategy was designed to keep cases as close to zero as possible. It was a massive undertaking by the government that involved mass testing, government-imposed quarantines, and strict lockdowns of entire cities. The policy began in early 2020, after the Chinese government locked down the city of Wuhan, confining more than 11 million people to their homes. The methods used by the government were strict and far-reaching. Even a few COVID-19 cases could trigger a lockdown, which could span entire neighborhoods or cities. Contact tracing apps were used to monitor people's movements, and residents needed to use the app to enter public places. If they crossed paths with an infected person or traveled to a high-risk area, mandatory testing or isolation was ordered. Mass testing was carried out in places where COVID-19 had been reported, and residents often needed a recent negative COVID-19 test to enter a business or public facility. Even those who had only distant contact with an infected person could be forced to isolate, with electronic seals attached to their doors to enforce compliance. At first, the public response to the policy was positive. Many Chinese citizens expressed pride in their government's ability to keep cases to almost none. However, as the virus developed multiple increasingly transmissible variants, cases began to increase across China and the lockdowns became more severe. Public anger mounted, and the protests erupted in multiple cities. People started to question if this rigorous approach was even working. Was it effective in keeping cases under control, or did it just fuel public resentment? While China claims that its approach has kept coronavirus cases and deaths low compared to Western countries, the public's response shows that the policy's heavy-handed methods have left a lasting impact. A 4-sided white paper, a symbol of resistance. The wave of unrest was ignited by a fire in Urumqi that claimed the lives of 10 people. The lockdown measures not only prevented firefighters from entering the building, but also made it difficult for the victims to leave. This fire would turn into a blazing inferno that would threaten to destroy the nation's foundations. It was a scene that nobody expected. Thousands of people began pouring onto the streets of China's cities, with their voices ringing out in protest. The protests that swept across China caught everyone by surprise, including government officials and citizens alike. The Chinese leadership was caught off guard. And then there was a brief moment where it seemed that the people might have a chance to effect change. But the authorities weren't about to let that happen. Instead, they deployed the police to crush the protests, using force to silence the voices of dissent. Despite the crackdown, the people persisted. They refused to be intimidated and continued to speak out against the regime. It was a scene that felt eerily familiar to those who lived through China's pro-democracy movements in 1989. But this time, the protests were not for political freedom, but for a return to normalcy after 3 years of draconian COVID-19 policies. As the protests grew, so did the list of demands. Freedom of speech, an end to censorship, and even the right to choose which movies to watch. And while their efforts may not have toppled the government, they still had an impact. Like the Tiananmen Square protests before them, these demonstrations had significant long-term effects on China. The protests showed that even in a country as tightly controlled as China, there is still a desire for freedom and democracy. They also exposed the deep divisions within Chinese society and the growing disconnect with the ruling Communist Party. And while the government may have succeeded in suppressing the protests, they couldn't erase the memory of what had happened. As the demonstrations spread to some 20 cities, a humble piece of blank paper emerged as a symbol of the movement. This became known as the White Paper Protests. The idea originated in the Be Water movement in Hong Kong to hinder identification of the ringleaders to minimize non-compliance with the law, hence reducing the risk of arrest. The blank paper signified the government's attempts to silence the people and the protesters' determination to speak out, even if their voices had to be expressed through a simple piece of paper. The gesture was a statement about the silencing of dissent and a challenge to authorities, as if to say, "Are you going to arrest me for holding a sign saying nothing?" In Shanghai, some of those who gathered at a vigil to remember the victims of the fire came clutching sheets of paper. Similarly, protesters in Beijing came armed with scraps of paper to a demonstration at Tsinghua University, which was once attended by President Xi Jinping. In another striking video, a young woman could be seen walking through the streets of Wuzhen with chains around her wrists and duct tape over her mouth, holding a sheet of blank paper in her hands. Role of the protests in eliminating zero-COVID policy. New policies are being implemented, but there are concerns about the impact of the protests on the government's responsiveness to public pressure. Although the protests were not the sole factor, they did play a role in the government's rapid decision-making. The economic impact of the policies was also a key consideration, as investors like Terry Gao warned that the strict measures were hurting China's global supply chains. As the protests went on, some suggested that these could provide the government with a way to lessen the blame if the country experienced an increase in COVID-related fatalities. Some people suggested that local governments who were under immense pressure to reduce the spread of the virus, while also promoting economic growth, may have used the protests as a bargaining chip against the central government. What do you think? Could the local authorities have used protests to leverage their policies? The light at the end of the tunnel was that despite the government's reluctance to acknowledge the protesters' role in the policy shift, there were signs that the message was being heard. Chinese leader Xi Jinping acknowledged the public's frustration with zero-COVID policies during a meeting with European Council President Charles Michel in Beijing. This was a rare acknowledgement of imperfection for Xi, who had put so much personal stake behind the zero-COVID policy. Whatever the reasons, the protests may have been a call for a return to normalcy, but they also served as a reminder of the power of public pressure in China. As the country continues to navigate the challenges of the pandemic and the shifting political landscape, it remains to be seen what role future protests will play in shaping China's future. The pathway to future protests. Amidst the tumultuous events in China, a glimmer of hope has emerged for the country's young generation. The protests have shown that even in the face of censorship and repression, the Chinese people have a way to make their voices heard. For many young people who have grown up in the era of increasing social control, this is a sign that change is possible. The Chinese government has a history of skillfully managing mass protests, neutralizing them before they pose a threat to the regime. However, the recent surge of zero-COVID protests could potentially mark a turning point. The protesters primarily focused on pandemic-related issues, but their goals also extended beyond that. They hoped for a society that is more open, where economic development can coexist with civil activism and intellectual discourse. As the Chinese diaspora becomes more involved in domestic movements, future protests may receive transnational participation, adding a new dimension to China's political landscape. The young people who have enjoyed the benefits of China's economic development are also impacted by the slowing economy, tough job market, and strict COVID-19 policies. It is no secret that they will take on the role of being the primary force behind these movements. Despite the uncertainty surrounding the protests' impacts, they have shown that even in the face of censorship and repression, people can use creative tools to make their voices heard. As the government seeks to appease public unrest by fulfilling selective demands, it remains to be seen whether future protests will make broader demands for civil rights. But if the Chinese people continue to demand change, the government's usual strategy to distract and diffuse may eventually become insufficient. Do you think Chinese citizens have discovered a newfound courage to raise their voice against the repressive regime? Let us know in the comments below, and make sure to like and subscribe to stay updated.